Marvel just released an anti-hero movie, or at least that's what people are saying. When discussing anti-heroes, characters like Punisher or Venom often come to mind. That is, characters who commit morally correct actions like stopping crime, but through extremely violent methods or using lethal force. However, I don't think the Thunderbolts members have the same level of everyday violence as the Punisher. Rather, I think we consider them as anti-heroes because it's a team made up of people who have made mistakes in the past. They have a redemption narrative arc, and because we understand that some of them really don't want to be heroes, but rather circumstances lead them to perform heroic acts, which is not the same. This means that there are many characteristics that we link with anti-heroes, from methods to motivations. But here's something you might not have thought of. We usually believe that an anti-hero must be very dark because it's a different alternative to the bright classic heroes. But in reality, Steven Universe and even El Chapulín Colorado could also be considered anti-heroes, because each of them breaks with what we think a hero should be, which tells us that there are many types of anti-heroes. In this video, we'll discuss the true definition of an anti-hero and explore the 5 distinct types that exist. And how do different characters from the Thunderbolts movie represent different types of anti-heroes? This video is spoiler-free for the Thunderbolts movie. Welcome to Geek Beats, providing small doses of culture and geek vitamins for the mind. Today we'll discuss the Thunderbolts and the 5 types of anti-heroes. What is an anti-hero? An anti-hero is a character that lacks the typical qualities associated with conventional heroes like Superman or Captain America. Those who have unshakable morality, a sense of duty, and deeply altruistic motivation. In anti-heroes, it's different because they usually have more selfish motivations, more violent methods, and often they don't want to be taken as a symbol or be considered heroes. A clear example is the character Punisher, who in stories like Welcome Back to Frank confronts a group of anti-heroes who see him as their leader and inspiration. The scene recalls the confrontation between Daredevil and the police in the Born Again series. This week I saw a video specifically about that on Instagram, so you can follow me there. Although anti-heroes are often considered a modern concept, are there examples of such characters in classic literature? Such is the case of Don Quixote, who is a satire of the brave, strong, and invincible knights of the stories of his time. This is a character who absurdly confronts windmills and seems to live in an illusion. Despite his madness, he genuinely seeks justice. This character teaches us 2 crucial lessons about anti-heroes. The first is that even though we think an anti-hero should be a dark character, precisely to be able to break with the classic concept of heroism, the reality is that they can also be a more comedic or lighter character than a traditional hero. Secondly, Don Quixote demonstrates that these characters can be the heroes of their own tale. But if we look at it from the outside, we realize that they may be immersed in an illusion of what justice is, something we often see through anti-heroes in comics, since we have a clear general concept of anti-hero. Let's go to the 5 types of anti-heroes that we find in the story, from the lightest to the darkest. The first type is the classic anti-hero. They are characters that challenge our perception of what a hero should be. In other words, it's a character who does good, but strays from the way we usually see heroes. Here we can talk about characters like Steven Universe, who is not particularly good at fighting, is in touch with his feelings, and even has more defensive powers. We could also discuss El Chapulín Colorado, a character who is neither particularly strong nor intelligent. However, I can't deny that both perform heroic actions. They just don't look like what we think a hero should look like. Then there's the reluctant anti-hero characters like the Guardians of the Galaxy in their first movie, who really weren't interested in being heroes and preferred to stay more on the sidelines of situations that had nothing to do with them. But if they see an injustice and there's no one else around, they do feel compelled to intervene. The Old Man, Logan version of Wolverine, begins his story retired, living with his family and reluctant to use his claws. But circumstances force him to go another way, later on in The Condor. The unscrupulous hero is a common type of anti-hero that often comes to mind when discussing the subject. It's a character who usually has a twisted view of what justice is and how to achieve it. Characters like Punisher, Deadpool, or Venom easily fit here, who usually stop crime through extremely violent actions, which separates them from other types of heroes. Just as we saw in the Civil War comic, where Captain America brutally beats Punisher for having killed some supervillains. Even though Captain America himself and his allies were also criminals during the events of this comic. I find this Civil War example interesting, because even in a story where Captain America is a criminal and fugitive, we still see him as a hero with characteristics different from those of Punisher. Then there's the heroic villain, characters with no qualms about committing reprehensible or illegal acts like theft or murder. Sometimes they find themselves in situations that make them do the right thing, like certain versions of Harley Quinn. And finally, we have the false hero, who is really a villain who turns out to be the protagonist of their story. So we as viewers form an empathy bond with them, as we experience the story through their eyes. So we often come to understand very well why they act in a certain way, and even come to agree with them and idolize them on many occasions. A character can possess traits of different anti-hero types, which vary based on the version and writer. I believe a specific Thunderbolts comic effectively illustrated these two anti-hero archetypes. As demonstrated, anti-heroes vary, which is evident in Warren Ellis's Thunderbolts run. On one hand, Songbird, a convicted criminal, attempts to prevent the team from causing excessive damage. And she even cares about the population, which puts her in the category of a heroic villain. Conversely, there are cases like Matt Gargan's Venom, who aims to gain fame and sell his life story rights. Bullseye, who does missions for violence, or Norman Osborn, motivated by power. All of them are false heroes, because the story of the Thunderbolts is not presented from their point of view. They are celebrated by their country's population, although their motivations and methods are far from heroic. This comic showcases an intriguing character dynamic, making it a perfect starting point, especially with the recent release of the Thunderbolts movie. And it's available through my friends at Panini. Now that we know what anti-heroes are and their types, let's talk about the characters we saw in the Thunderbolts movie. But first we must ask, are the Thunderbolts heroes or anti-heroes? It depends if we take the definition that an anti-hero is a character who strays from the typical characteristics of a hero. So do you understand why most people consider them anti-heroes? Since a central and recurring theme in these characters is that they all have a troubled past from which they want to escape. But it should also be said that many of them were not aware of their actions. Yelena was controlled by the Red Room while Bucky was controlled by Hydra. A classic hero cannot commit such evil acts as they did. But we should ask ourselves if a person who is mentally controlled is responsible for their actions. According to philosophers like Kant, will plays a fundamental role in this point. A person under mental control can't be held accountable for their actions regardless of Tony Stark's opinion. If we remove from the board, for example, all these evil actions that Yelena or Bucky committed while they were being controlled, then perhaps for some people they seem more like heroes than anti-heroes. Yelena spent years freeing the Black Widows from mental control. While she feels more like a reluctant heroine, Bucky has performed several genuinely heroic acts. However, there's another factor at play. Even though they were unaware of their actions, the weight of the past is there, which makes these characters carry a deep guilt and a need for redemption that we don't see in more classic heroes. Considering everything, that's why we tend to associate them more with anti-heroes. Perhaps not so much because we blame them for their past actions, but because this inherent darkness in them makes us separate them from what we usually think heroes should be. In the case of Bucky and Yelena, I feel Yelena would be considered a heroine, while Bucky's classification is less clear, potentially falling into the anti-hero category. Reluctant as she helps when she feels responsible. Whereas Bucky is a classic anti-hero because he does good in a quite classic way, but he has darker emotional characteristics that we don't usually associate with heroes. Other team members present us with different dynamics.
I have ruled my entire life by its mandates. I have dedicated my life to its mandates.
While John Walker was not mentally controlled like Bucky or Yelena, his great crime was committed under the influence of the super soldier serum, which amplified his emotions. On the other hand, Red Guardian wasn't mentally controlled, but blindly believed in the Soviet Union's communist ideals. Oh, how sweet. The interesting thing about them is that both acted under the belief that they were serving their country.
I've just done what they've been ordering me to do.
What makes them then different from Steve Rogers? If you think about it, Steve was also a national symbol. He also fought for his country. But the big difference is that Steve, besides, he has a very clear moral code that he always put above everything else, even above the law of his country. As seen in Civil War, John Walker followed orders and did what the army asked without questioning their methods or purpose. If he's somewhat foolish, honestly, while Red Guardian, despite being a person who sought good and felt satisfaction in helping people, acted motivated by a deep need for external validation. Something we don't see in Steve Rogers. Characteristics that put them on the side of the anti-heroes. I'm not sure if John Walker would be a ruthless hero or a classic anti-hero, but Red Guardian is definitely a classic anti-hero. Ghost also falls into the reluctant heroine category, but tell me in the comments, which category would you put each member in? Sentry is an intriguing case. While his traits are derived from characters like Superman, there's also a notable darkness to him. Motives and means that set him apart from traditional heroism. I can't share much about him due to spoilers, but subscribe for an upcoming video specifically about Sentry. But for me, the most interesting thing about the Thunderbolts movie is that it left me with the feeling that heroism is changing. Because beyond the surface, where its characters have redemption arcs, Thunderbolts introduced us to characters from a post-pandemic generation who have difficulties connecting with others, relating. And they feel a great inner void that they struggle to fill in their day-to-day. In this way, their heroism is not only reflected when they fight in great world threats, but in their daily battles where they face internal and personal enemies. Frodo's struggle is relatable, unlike that of classic heroes. Perhaps then, Captain America's shield is a symbol of a time that no longer exists. One of the heroic, nearly perfect figures who now struggle to connect with younger generations. So, the Thunderbolts, with all their flaws, make us wonder if anti-heroes are the new heroic figures of today's world. If you enjoyed this video and want to keep discussing anti-heroes and anti-villains, a distinct idea, check out these other videos you might find intriguing. You can refer to the comics I mentioned in the Panini catalog as examples. That's all for today. I am Joe the Geek Monitor. Keep looking beyond the obvious.